Hi, everyone. This is Kyle Welch with RCR Wireless News, and I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar. We're joined today by Jason Byrne, Director of Product Management at Greenlee Communications. We'll be discussing the topic of fully utilizing gigabit internet connections in order to deliver seamless Wi-Fi throughout the home. And at this time, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Jason to talk more about improving Wi-Fi connections in the home.
Well, thank you, Kyle. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss one of the hottest topics in that of delivering seamless Wi-Fi throughout the home. If we can, let's get on to the next slide. Okay. As you can see here, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to review the latest Cisco VNI or Visual Networking Index report. But there's some great predictions in there around internet traffic over the next couple of years. One of the biggest things there was the global IP traffic is forecasted to grow nearly threefold over the next 5 years. So it's gone through some exponential growth recently, and it looks like that's not going to abate. Looks like monthly traffic per user or per capita is going from 10 gig to well over 25 gig. So some serious growth. I think one of the other nuggets that I want to bring up here is that a busy hour internet traffic, versus average internet traffic. So the average, busy hours were the busiest 60-minute period in a day. And last year in 2015, it actually increased 51%. So there's various aspects of global IP that's growing at different rates. But also more specifically around in 2015, there was another nugget in there about wired devices accounting for the majority of IP traffic. But by 2020, traffic from wireless and mobile devices will account for 2/3 of the total IP traffic. So you can see the main drivers to some of these predictions are around more users, more devices, faster speeds being delivered, and even more of the internet share coming from video. But if you look at Wi-Fi in particular, which is what we're interested in today, looking in the rearview mirror, Wi-Fi went through a factor of 100 times increase, or a factor of 100 increase in demand for bandwidth over the last 5 years. And you can see this explosion in Wi-Fi is really just beginning. We move on to the next slide. You can see here that, if you look more closely at the types of traffic, you can see that video dominates the content on the internet. You can see in the box highlighted in red, Netflix and YouTube alone count for over half the internet downstream traffic. Even more startling fact is that between 70 and 80% of those users on Netflix and YouTube is actually viewed over Wi-Fi. So the bulk of internet traffic is video, and the bulk of that video is actually viewed over Wi-Fi. So clearly, forecast is that video will continue to dominate the internet traffic in particular. Internet video is expected to go up fourfold between 2015 and 2020, or 2016. Consumer internet video traffic will be 82% of the consumer traffic by 2020. And even more startling is this video surveillance. Traffic nearly doubled in the past year and is going to grow tenfold by 2020. And I'm not sure if you attended CES show in Vegas this year, but augmented reality or virtual reality traffic actually quadrupled in the past year, and is expected to increase 61-fold over the next 4 years. And this really highlights, the killer apps that are coming in the gigabit age. New forms of gaming such as integrated daily life, remote medicine and distance learning, telepresence, and more sensor data being collected and stored. Two-way persistent high-quality video to replace recorded video, and then interactions with doctors. And again, we touched on augmented reality. If we move on to the next slide. Now let's get a little more into the devices that people are using them on. Folks are using mobile devices more and more for their internet access, but 80% of that data traffic is actually handled indoors. Where do you spend most of your time? Typically it's in work or at home. So that's where the 80% comes from. And then last year, mobile traffic offload. So the offload from your internet, whenever you're surfing the internet on your phone, that traffic is typically offloaded. More of that was actually offloaded than sent over the cellular network. So more than 50% of the time, that internet traffic that you're doing on your cell phone or your tablet is actually going over Wi-Fi. And then you can see in the infographic in the middle some of the trade-offs compared to Wi-Fi, really giving you an insight into how important Wi-Fi has become in our daily life. You know, as an example, 60% of people can't go without Wi-Fi access for more than a day. And you can see some of the comparison with coffee and chocolate. Makes for some amusing reading when you compare it to Wi-Fi. And then this culminates with over 2/3 of US consumers prefer Wi-Fi to cellular. And that clearly comes down to user experience. So, okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Now let's talk about some of the high value content. You know, what people are watching when people are watching their TV, but not on the big hunk of metal that's on the wall, rather on the numerous devices, from the smartphones to the tablets, etc. You know, TV everywhere has become one of the bedrocks of a service provider's offering. And I guess the dominant medium people are using is, of course, Wi-Fi. People are watching their TV, but not on the big TV screen, on their smartphones, on their tablets. Now add into the mix the latest high-value content in voice over Wi-Fi. A lot of service providers you can see on the right-hand side started deploying and started offering that to customers. So, so much so that the latest predictions are that voice over Wi-Fi is expected to surpass voice over IP and voice over LTE combined. Now that's a startling fact, and certainly high definition voice is part of that as well. And if folks are now are coming to rely on viewing their high value content over Wi-Fi, then you can see why 72% of consumers consider Wi-Fi vitally important in every room of their house. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. We can move on to the next slide. I think in the description of the webinar, we talked about Gigabit offering. So we talked about up to now Wi-Fi and some of the drivers behind that. But here you can see the contrast between where consumers care most about, which is Wi-Fi. But the battleground for service providers right now has really shifted into delivering gigabit speeds to your doorstep. You know, you can watch any TV ad on recently from any of the service providers. Vast majority of them are talking about gigabit Ethernet speed or gigabit speed, broadband speed. And the map you see on the slide here is a visual representation of all the major cities and global gigabit services. You know, so the gigabit movement is in full swing, and it's really not a monopoly in quite a lot of the cities. Actually, there's 15, I think, metropolitan areas with multiple choices for gigabit service. And both cable and telco service providers promoting that, especially in their marketing efforts. And on a global basis, many major markets are expected to adopt gigabit services over the next 5 years, with coverage in some mature markets hitting 50%. But remember, the service is just to your front door, not inside your home where you need it. So you might get a gigabit service to your doorstep. Now let's get into the details of actually delivering, you know, that gigabit service over Wi-Fi. So if you move on to the next slide. On here, you know, I want to get into the challenges around offering Wi-Fi throughout the home. The last stat I saw was that the average number of apps per smartphone was 33, which sounds high, but each one of those apps is constantly connecting to the internet looking for updates. Even when your applications are doing nothing, having them run on the background is causing a signaling storm or a control plane storm in the amount of traffic that's actually looking for updates. Now factor in how many devices are in the home. And the latest stat I saw was that there's an average of 11 connected devices in 2016. All challenging for the same Wi-Fi channel, all contesting to get their traffic to their device at the same time. And there was a prediction from OECD about 17 devices by 2017, and by 2022 there's going to be 50 connected devices in the home. You know, if you think your home Wi-Fi is annoying now, it's flaky, it's slow, it's got dead zones, just wait until you start streaming 4K TV, laptops, gaming, all the different IoT connections that are out there or about to come. The future really does depend on your home network. But even today's home networks aren't ready. You can see on the bottom right-hand side, Intel really is predicting over 200 billion connected devices by 2020. So you can see the problems are just starting when it comes to Wi-Fi. And over the next couple of years, it's predicted Wi-Fi will carry more internet traffic to consumer devices than mobile and wired combined. That's a startling fact. So let's move on to the next slide and get into a little more detail. Okay, now let's get into some of the challenges away from the devices themselves, more about electronic interference. If we look at that, one of the biggest challenges with Wi-Fi is the spectrum it plays in, which is unlicensed spectrum. If cellular providers have only in recent years figured out how to reduce the number of dropped calls, as evidenced by some of the advertising, can you hear me now? But imagine this problem has been over licensed spectrum. Now factor that same quality or user experience is now hopefully going to happen on unlicensed spectrum. You can imagine, common sense tells you that problems should be a lot worse, and they are. The table on the right-hand side really highlights the impact of other electronic devices have on unlicensed spectrum, especially where Wi-Fi plays. One of the biggest interferers is obviously the electronic devices themselves. You can see cordless phones have a massive impact on Wi-Fi when they're being used, obviously, and really even if it's far away, all the way down to microwave ovens, which even on a 50% duty cycle can reduce your Wi-Fi throughput by up to 2/3. To the extent of this problem, recently reported by Jupiter Research was that I think over 2/3 of all Wi-Fi residential problems are linked to those electronic or interfering devices. Now let's move on. Next thing to think about from some of the challenges is more around home construction. You can see that even wood framing has an impact and causes interference. But this really starts to ratchet up or significantly increase when you start using bricks and mortar into the equation. RF propagation does well in free space, but when you start introducing some sort of types of materials, again, bricks and mortar, especially outside the US, this gets even worse when you start looking at metal framing in the construction. And with the worst type being mirrors, silver lining on the back of a mirror, that causes for propagation issues, with RF signals, let alone unlicensed RF. And one interesting tidbit is that, the impact water has on RF propagation, well, the human body is 80% water. So merely having more people in the home will by default impact your Wi-Fi, even if they're doing nothing with their devices in the house. Now on the next slide, let's get into the details. What are, when service providers come out to install, what are the current best practices for folks to install that Wi-Fi service? Let's move away from some of the inherent challenges in delivering Wi-Fi to more around what is the best practices. Well, I don't know about you, but I had one service provider actually came out to my house, installed an access point, stood right next to it, showed me 5 bars of signal strength, and left. Well, later that day, I went up to the kids' rooms, kids came home from school, and I had no coverage. So technicians really are measured on the number of jobs or installs they get done in a day. They need to get in or get out as quickly as possible, and they really are measured on that. The other problem with Wi-Fi service in the home is the tools are more to the point lack thereof of tools that the technicians actually have to install Wi-Fi. But, we've been working with service providers on a global basis, and we found in working with some of those guys, the technicians really have rudimentary tools, if anything at all. Quite a few of them use some of the free tools that are on Google Play or Android, or any of the iOS, but most use those free apps, and these really are rudimentary applications, simply providing the signal strength, and typically show a graph of the access points within range. I'm sure you've been around Wi-Fi long enough to know that signal strength really is not an accurate measure of quality of experience. It tells you your signal strength, but nothing else. It doesn't tell you if your Netflix is working or pixelating. But it's really a one-dimensional aspect and doesn't take account of congestion, other devices, streaming traffic, or the interference from some of the other electronic devices we talked about. The other problem with the technician practice of finding the best channel for the access point, they really don't do anything there at all. What we found is most technicians will actually power on the unit and let the unit or the access point or the gateway or the cable modem figure out what the best channel is. And that's clearly not working based on the number of issues that have been cropped up from a Wi-Fi reporting standpoint. The most common practices really count the number of access points on a particular channel. If simply counting the number of SSIDs on the same channel, picking the channel with the least number of SSIDs, that can work, but it really doesn't take account of actually congestion on those channels. So you might have the least number of SSIDs on a channel, but it might be heavily congested. But there's no tools that are out there in the marketplace, free tools that will actually give you some insight into that. It really doesn't take account of whether some clients on some of those SSIDs are actually streaming 4K or high def video. And then if that's the case, then the decision actually caused a lot of heartache for the user because you picked the wrong channel. So, the tools themselves or lack of tools really are causing the heartburn. And if you move on to the next slide, you'll see some of the impact of that. So here you can see, the results of the best practices currently being performed by those techs as well. There was a survey recently done, and they found almost 2/3 of global consumers have issues with residential Wi-Fi. 2/3 have issues with residential. And this really results in a pretty consistent across the globe metric that over half, and we've seen numbers go all the way up to 80%, over half all customer service calls end up being Wi-Fi related. Customers calling in with low zones, dead zones, intermittent issues, and the list goes on. And that's a massive, massive expense that service providers are not paying too much attention to. Or if they did, they would change the installation techniques and really arm those technicians with the right tools. But certainly that's a movement that across the globe we're seeing a lot of service providers starting to pay attention, really around arming and training the technicians to make sure they get it right the first time. Move on to the next slide. You can see when this happens, right, the technicians are doing very little to get the things right first time. Customers are calling in to complain. You can see from this slide, there was a recent survey done across the country where somebody's when somebody's Netflix starts to stall or stop working, do you call Netflix to complain? Do you call Apple or the device that you might be watching it on to complain? No. The first person you call, the company you blame, is the service provider who installed the Wi-Fi. So a very interesting fact. No matter what the application or the application or the vendor itself doesn't get blamed, but the service provider gets blamed. You can see over half of all customers point the finger at the service providers. And I guess that speaks to the earlier slide on half of all service calls end up being Wi-Fi related. If we move on to the next slide, it'll get into a little more detail around, this was done, the data we got here was a big tier 1 service provider, cable MSO provider in a very large metropolitan area, actually surveyed over a space of a year the most common resolution techniques for Wi-Fi installation or Wi-Fi trouble. And you can see some of the issues are some of the techniques from configuring the wireless network, education of the customer, and that ends up being a big part of that. But they really don't have the tools to help explain or educate the customer. The next is replace the gateway, quite expensive, obviously. Some of the CPE, if the CPE was supplied by the customer, that might need to be replaced, replacing the router, resetting the gateway or the set-top box, that has quite a big an impact as well. And then location of the gateway, very important part of that. Or rewire the residents to help support that relocation of the gateway. But you can see there's various different techniques to try and solve the problems of Wi-Fi service or user experience issues in the home. And quite a few of them end up being swapping out hardware, when needlessly swapping out hardware when they really didn't need to do that. Some of them just power cycle the gateways or the set-top boxes to try and get that, the wireless set-top boxes. So that, it's quite startling to see the different techniques that some technicians use, and quite often very costly as well. If we move on to the next slide. Now let's get into some of the seamless and some of the techniques used to try and provide coverage and seamless mobility within the home, right? So now you've typically service providers will install or have been installing a single access point. a lot of service providers, especially in North America, and some in EMEA, are actually looking at multiple access points. And multiple access points, some are really starting to look at certainly at least more than one, but there's no magic to making multiple access point networks work. Wireless clients just assume that all APs with the same SSID are configured the same. So obviously you have to have the same SSID name, same password, same encryption, and that sort of thing. But they're all just different points of access to the same network. So a client will scan all the channels looking for APs publishing the same SSID, and will pick whichever one suits its needs best. But once the network clients stay with the same APs, as long as it's meeting its client's needs, or is good enough. But if the client later thinks it could be better off with another AP in a network, it scans the network of all the channels looking for other APs with that SSID. And if it finds a better one, a candidate AP, then it will switch over and hopefully automatically roam over to the AP. But it sounds great, but the catch is this is all multi-AP roaming. In general, wireless technologies provide access point roaming protocol, but the client radio, ultimately it's the client radio that makes the decision to hand off to the next access point when retransmissions and receive signal levels indicate, it's time to hand off. A decision to hand off too soon generally leads to the next access point, leads to skipping back and forth between access points. As a result, really client radio manufacturers generally choose to dampen the handoff process, making their KPIs quite strict, and wait until it's really necessary or absolutely necessary to hand off to the next access point. So if the service provider puts in both or multiple access points, what they're finding is the clients themselves who ultimately make the decision. Every model radio device behaves differently, especially when roaming between proprietary mechanisms. If they use different EPs, it can add a lot of complexity. Some, when you use the same AP, some of the roaming actually has become pretty good. But there's definitely poorly engineered clients out there with poor roaming algorithms or thresholds, which don't actually roam when they should or end up being sticky. And the term sticky ends up being used quite often in this place. Sometimes it helps to force the clients to connect to the SSID, but that's not seamless. That's not a seamless Wi-Fi connection. So once the clients decide to associate with the next one, it starts sending disassociation frames, then it sends reassociation frames, and there's a process that goes through. It's quite a lengthy process. And we've seen some numbers where the reassociation process takes about maybe 68 milliseconds, under 100 milliseconds, which is pretty fast. But the problem is the entire roaming process where it will interrupt wireless applications for much longer than that, right? So less than 100 milliseconds, some latency issues you might get away with. Human ear especially, I think it's less than 200. But, if you're downloading a file or doing anything, the mere fact it takes well over 5 seconds. Because you've started to start seeing a degradation, then there's some retransmission. That less than 100 milliseconds is really only when the decision is made to switch over. The 5 seconds in this mobility really comes from trying to retransmit, okay, I'm not getting a good signal here, I should probably start looking. And that's where the additional time ends up coming from. The actual media that roaming is dependent on the client devices, these roam triggers. The client really decides when to move, how come one question we keep getting asked, how come this is different in the enterprise, where the perception is that that's a seamless Wi-Fi service? Well, I think first of all, the clients are usually high-end laptops rather than some of the smartphones. Those laptops have room for some smart radios, really don't remain as sticky as smartphones. The other aspect is that in the enterprise, there's Wi-Fi management controllers. And those controllers, the really purpose of those controllers is to optimize the handoff process. And that's got, a lot better from a handoff procedures and timing. But the industry really is now shifting towards a wireless network virtualization. So while it's still employing the use of the controller, the method has really got sophisticated. So basically the controller actively monitors and listens to all the APs on the network, selecting the best one for transmitting data. But roaming is eliminated because really what you've got now is the client sees all the APs as a single AP. It's a virtual AP. So for certain enterprise applications, this is an effective solution. But for the home or small office, the benefit might not outweigh the hardware, the setup, and really its cost associated with that. And this is why the main reason why enterprise Wi-Fi user experience is far better than in the home. It costs. There's a cost associated with it. Okay, let's move away from some of the technical aspects of that. If we move on to the next slide. You can see here, so now some folks have made the decision, okay, we should probably install more than one AP. Clearly, there's multiple ways to do it. And what I was showing here is power line adapters. Let's look at the power line adapter devices, which need to be plugged in directly into the wall socket. And the Home Plug Alliance has made great strides over the last couple of years. In general, this has improved the coverage in dead zones, but they really don't work well if they're plugged into surge protectors, power strips, that sort of thing. I think another aspect is, this wall works off standard 110 in the US. The data signal between them depends on the quality of the electrical wiring itself. So if it's an old house, there could be some issues trying to use some power line adapters, which really help to extend that Wi-Fi coverage. And I think the other part of it is actually when folks come home, turn on their appliances. If the broadband is going over the electrical wire, and then all of a sudden you start to use your microwave, your vacuum cleaner, that sort of thing, all that noise tends to disrupt the broadband, and then it's causing some issues as well. So, using power line adapters, and another one, I guess, might be in apartment buildings. You've got shared electrical sockets. Clearly, you probably want to set up your Wi-Fi to have some security there, so that you're not sharing your broadband with your upstairs neighbor. So that's some of the drawbacks on the power line extenders. Certainly cheap, $100 or less, and folks are starting to use them, but it does come with some drawbacks. If we move on to the next slide, you can see some of the conversations we've had with some of the service providers, especially in the MSO space, really are starting to deploy some of the MOCA extenders. Really, what MOCA does is extend the homeowner's wired or Wi-Fi network to an area of the home where wireless coverage really was weak or a dead zone, which really helps to enable multiple routers in different parts of the home. And this is all done over CoAP. MOCA extenders can bring network connectivity, whether it's wired or wireless. You can see in this diagram that we actually have both here. And last year, MOCA 2.0 did some benchmarking, was done on that, and found demonstrated 400 meg, I think, was the fastest speed in about 90% of the coax outlets that were done in the benchmarking. But MOCA just released a 2.5 spec, and that was about 2 months ago, and that supports up to 2 gig of a data rate. So we talked earlier about delivering a gig to the home. Now we're starting to see inside the home where you can actually deliver greater than a gig, and certainly MOCA is starting to help there. I think it will take a while before the first wave of MOCA 2.5 will hit the mainstream. So it really does leave a bit of a gap between that and the gigabit to your door. Okay, let's get into the next slide, which is getting a lot of publicity and that of mesh networking. So what I want to talk about here really is, it's really an arms race when it comes to home Wi-Fi. The more Wi-Fi hotspots, the worse the overall experience is. Clearly, if you have more neighbors, especially if they're on the same channels, that sort of thing. And it's the reverse of what you'd think. The more APs, the better. But really, in order for those Wi-Fi access points to play nice, they really need to be expensive equipment from high-end suppliers. Well, that's not the case. That's not the case in the home. Mesh networking really tries to solve this problem. And it does a pretty good job. Consumer-grade Wi-Fi or mesh Wi-Fi solutions are really starting to hit the market already. You've probably seen a few advertisements on that. Mesh adds far more weight when it really implements a self-organized network, or SON, which is really an automation technology designed to make the planning, config, management, and self-healing of the network really simple and faster. So mesh networking is great, connecting multiple access points throughout the home and really bouncing that traffic from one to the optimal access point. But when you factor that in with SON, that certainly helps self-configure self-configures, self-manages, self-heals, self-defends. There's a lot more ways. It's one of the first wave, but it's really a very lofty goal. Regards to mesh, very lofty goal. I'd say the first wave of Wi-Fi SOM is really just starting to get deployed. But in all likelihood, it's going to follow the same SOM maturity cycle that happened in the cellular world. So it'll take a couple of waves for SOM, truly does work as functional, highly functional in Wi-Fi. And if that's the case, that means several years. That's probably several years away before we get a fully mature SOM solution in the marketplace. Another thing to think about current mesh or Wi-Fi mesh networking, it does come with its drawback. It all boils down to the multi-hop dilemma, which there's many, many white papers on. Apart from the cost of installing multiple access points, which can double or triple the installation cost. There's issues around when you're at the edge of a mesh network, your connection is only as fast as the slowest link back to the base station. Bandwidth degradation, radio interference, latency due to the multiple hops, etc. Either way you look at it, mesh does help improve the Wi-Fi user experience, but at what cost? That's really what folks are starting to look into now. So if we move on to the next slide. Now I want to take a look at, we've touched on the different techniques that folks are using. We did show, or actually what I'm showing here in the slide, the first slide is that this survey, again, we talked about was a tier 1 MSO. But two of the biggest aspects or the biggest techniques that really have the biggest bang for their buck is really in that location is the first. It's really that no matter where you use a single AP, multiple AP, the very first thing you have to do is get the location right of where you put that AP, or where you put those multiple APs. So no matter how much technology moves forward, you still have to physically place them in the right place. You need to identify that optimal location. And the second thing is that configuring the access point, right? The wireless configuration of the access point. And this boils down mostly around the channel selection for the 2.4 and the 5. If this selection is made wrong, or incorrectly, the user experience has it's greatly impacted by picking the wrong channel. There could be several other clients causing congestion. There could be a lot of interference. But those two things together, location and the wireless configuration of the gateway, channel selection, both in the 2.4 and the 5 have a massive impact. Like I said, 63% of that issues. Let me see. I think that's all I want on that. So if we move on to the next slide. A little more detail around channel selection. Not enough, what we're finding is not enough folks are paying enough attention. Like I said, a lot of gateways, a lot of access points or cable modems do have their own, channel selection algorithms. But what you'll find is if you actually look at, you've got an average of 11 connected devices in the home, and they're not just in one spot. They're not just where the set-top box or the wireless gateway is. They're scattered throughout the home. I saw a stat where 10% of people actually watch video in the bathroom. So, the channel in one room the optimal channel in one room might be different than the optimal channel in the kitchen or the living room or the bedrooms or the master bedroom or out in the patio. So typically you want to, when you're taking trying to make a decision and gather as much data, you probably want to take as much measurements as possible throughout the home to make sure you do pick the optimal channel. I think the second aspect of that is folks really are not paying enough attention onto the channel utilization. This channel utilization is really critical part of a channel selection. If you pick an AP that has one other SSID on there, and the other channel has 10, most technicians will pick the one with one SSID. But what happens if there's 50 clients and they're all streaming 4K video? You've now picked the highest or the worst channel to put your Wi-Fi service on. So having a look and really understanding what the channel utilization is a big part of that. And then another aspect, really the last one really is don't guess the optimal channel. What we're finding is a lot of technicians are just looking at these free tools, and it's a complete mess of Wi-Fi design from all the neighbors. No, there is no Wi-Fi design when your neighbors just independently pick their own channel. But one technician might pick one channel when he looks at the mess of graphs, versus another technician might pick a different channel. So really what folks are starting to look for is more automated selection, channel selection. Tell them what channels to use for the 2.4 and 5 without having to interpret, 20, 30 different graphs or SSID channel allocation. So certainly optimized channel selection is a very big impact, big aspect of choosing your own thing. Hold on. Okay, if we move on to the next channel, or next slide, about this. You can see here, Wi-Fi surveys have changed over time. Certainly Wi-Fi surveys in the enterprise have gotten much more advanced, but now folks in the residential side are really starting to pay attention to the different aspects or different things that will impact the Wi-Fi. So certainly the number of devices. We've talked about that. It's gone to 11. It is 11 today, but it's moving to 50 in the next couple of years. The types of devices. An iPhone 5 has a different radio than an iPhone 6. Some of the different smartphones, different tablets, my connected TV, they all have different radios and potentially different Wi-Fi versions as well. But more importantly, it's about the traffic profile. I think customers really don't care about signal strength, signal to noise ratios. They just want to know if Netflix is going to work on my TV. Is Netflix going to work in the master bedroom? Is gaming going to work in the kids' bedroom? These are conversations that customers are not getting answers to from the technicians today. So when folks are doing surveys, these are the things that they're really starting to shift their mindset to start getting tools into the technician's hands so they can answer these types of questions. Really, we talked about the different versions on each of those different devices. And that really brings the reality into the picture versus looking at two dimensions. What's my signal strength? How many APs are on my channel? When you start factoring in this, the decision ends up being vastly different than what you typically get from a free tool. Excuse me, if you move on to the next slide. Great. So the conversations we've had with, again, service providers in the US and quite a lot in EMEA, what they're focusing on in order to deliver this Wi-Fi service throughout the home and a really, optimized user experience. The average home is 11 connected devices. A lot of tools that are on the marketplace today, single handheld test devices, even close to reality. How can you expect a single handheld to explain what the Wi-Fi situation is when there's 11 streaming devices, all doing different things, all located in different parts of the home? It makes it very, very difficult for those. And quite honestly, the service providers are starting to walk away from these single handheld. And they really want distributed devices that really simulate the home, but also stress the home, stress the Wi-Fi network. Even though the technician might go in at 10 a.m., come 7 o'clock, that whole environment changes because everybody's home. They're all doing their own, connected to their client. The technicians are looking at tools that can help them stress the network before they actually, at 10 in the morning without having to come back at 7 p.m. Again, each device is different, but more importantly, speak the customer's language. Technicians end up having the conversation, trying to answer a question like, will my Netflix work in the room? When the only dimension they have is, well, you got 5 bar. And clearly we know the answer to that. That really is not a good indicator. And customers really aren't RF experts. They don't know what signal to noise ratio is, and they don't care, and they never want to care. So really, folks are starting to look at using heat maps to explain and turn their tool to the customer to explain, this is where you're going to have coverage. Netflix is going to work here, or it's not going to work in the master bedroom. Would you like me to fix it? And that's where some of the tools really start to bring value, is upselling to meet those expectations. Now the upsell might be, just rewiring and moving the location of the gateway, or installing multiple access points, 2, 3 more, or even a mesh network. Again, the tools need to be there to explain to the customer why you need to do a mesh network. You just explain you need to spend more money. Those conversations typically don't go well. So a lot of the tools today really are bringing up and enabling customers or technicians to have that conversation. whether the customer should upsell. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay. There's an example of where really speaking the customer's language. This is an example of a tool called AirScout Wi-Fi testing, where it really does focus on the customer's language. The AirScout solution really delivers or gives a visual representation of the different applications. Show the customer where my web surfing is going to work, or really where's my 4K TV going to work. I've just got a 4K TV. I'm starting to watch Netflix. Where's that going to work in the home? And you can see it. So a typical single handheld solution. If you walked around the house, you'll see the left-hand side because it's a single client. But if you actually try and look at the applications themselves and really do a distributed solution from a testing standpoint, which is what AirScout delivers, you'll see the reality of the situation is far different than a single handheld. So really being able to speak that customer's language and explain what applications are going to work and where. If we move on to the next slide, which is really about the upsell, we talked about, sometimes you might not meet expectations. So you can see on the left-hand side, the 4K TV heat map really has a lot of issues, and you can explain that to the customer. Or you can also explain, if we can fix that problem, if we use a higher end gateway, or if I use multiple access points, or if I use mesh networking, then that's clearly something that we can help solve that problem and turn that 4K TV to be completely covered throughout the home. You can watch it in any room or even out in the patio. That conversation certainly are enabled to tools that are out there. Let me see. If we go on to the next slide, really is the summary slide. And here's what I want to do. It's really set the stage from a workflow standpoint. When we talked about seamless mobility, the first thing you got to do is before you start installing a Wi-Fi, you need to get the location right of the AP or the multiple AP, whatever that case may be. You do need to focus and put plenty of attention on getting that in the right place. The second thing really is get the right channel mapping for the home, both in the 2.4 and 5. And if there's multiple APs, to have a real structured channel mapping for the home, so there's not much overlap. And then really from there, quickly identify where the dead zones are, where the slow zones are, where some intermittent issues might happen. And you do that by using tools that really stress the home environment. And then this gives you an opportunity to have that conversation with the customer to upsell and to really meet those expectations. Whether it's a standalone access point or multiple access points or layering down an advanced costly mesh networking solution. And then really regarding seamless Wi-Fi, I think, the future of Wi-Fi in the home really looks like a lot like the present of Wi-Fi in your office. We're getting seamless Wi-Fi in the office, but that's very costly tools or very costly access points and high-end equipment. That's clearly not going to be the case of cost with no expense in the home. So we're having to wait for that feature set to really migrate down into those lower cost solutions. We do think that's probably a couple of years away before it becomes seamless throughout the home. Certainly there's some foray into that with mesh networking, but like I said earlier, it's certainly several years away before we get into that. So basically there will be more antennas everywhere, or access points quite possibly in every room, or most rooms. Certainly that's something that's starting to get some traction with the mesh networking, but also it's insanely fast when you start doing this. Certainly more expensive. You might even move to a new bill to pay your service provider or even some other company for the cloud services required to actually manage that in-home Wi-Fi. And that's something that certainly some conversations are happening in the service provider community as well. So with that, I've tried to discuss some of the trends that are going on across the industry in Wi-Fi. Touched on seamless mobility on the residential side, but also on the enterprise side. And then what are the best practices that folks are using before they start to install some of these higher end solutions? and what are the tools that really they need, and what the features that they need in order to install that, for at least the best optimal user experience over Wi-Fi throughout the home. So with that, 47, I think we're doing okay on time. I think we have time for us to let's enter into the Q&A section now. So with that, I'll pass back to Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So we've had a number of questions come in, so we'll just jump right in. The first one is, why is there this increase of networks setting up on the 5 gigahertz band?
Yeah, maybe I've been talking too much. Maybe I'll hand over to Bill. Bill, pass there.
Yes, well, one of the things that is happening more often, especially with the advancement of Wi-Fi, is many of the major advances in data rate are only supportable at the higher band because there's more spectrum available to support that capacity. But with the higher band comes a cost of propagation loss as well as range. And because of that, more devices are moving to that band, but not necessarily reaching the same range as 2.4 gigahertz. So I don't think 2.4 gigahertz is going to go away anytime soon, but the reality is the bandwidth in 2.4 gigahertz just isn't there to support tomorrow's applications. So many new devices require that band to operate effectively.
Okay, and we got a kind of a follow-up question. So obviously, as there's more adoption with the 5 gigahertz band, there will be congestion. I mean, how will that affect networks? So
with congestion, could you repeat that? I didn't get all that.
Yeah, so with increased use of 5 gigahertz, basically they're speculating there will be more congestion. Can you speak about the congestion on the 5 gigahertz band? Will that be an increasing issue as time goes?
Yes, it will, especially for applications like video. So as we know, the resolution of video streams are increasing on a regular basis. Just when we think we have enough capacity to support a good streaming experience, the TV codecs and standards then come out with something that basically quadruples the data rate or multiplies it by a factor of 10 or more, every couple of years. And so that reality is something that we are going to continue to face as more and more customers end up using or streaming in their homes. And so that is something that inevitably 2.4 gigahertz won't be able to support because the bandwidth and the capacity and spectrum just isn't there. So most of those advancements are going to 5 gigahertz and some even at higher frequencies such as 60 gigahertz.
Okay, great. Jason, earlier in the presentation, you mentioned 3x3. Can you discuss more exactly what that is and what that means?
Yes, so 3x3 is a term related to a technology called MIMO, multiple input, multiple output. And basically when you see a term like that, usually you'll see 1x1, 2x2, 3x3. From a physical standpoint, when a device is supporting something called 3x3, that generally means it has 3 antennas and it can support simultaneously 3 transmission and reception streams at the same time. And generally, the more transmission or reception streams you have available, the capacity goes up by the same amount, right? So if I have a 3x3 device and a 3x3 access point, roughly I should be able to achieve 3 times the capacity in both directions compared to a 1x1 device and a 1x1 access point.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Bill. Certainly if you could use some of the high-end laptops, they certainly use a lot more high-end MIMO. When you're looking at smartphones, whether it's a Droid or an iOS, certainly the space to actually support the higher-end MIMO technology, it lags far behind some of those laptops, purely because of real estate. So we're finding certainly access points, high-end clients certainly support that higher end, but it's a much slower migration on the smartphone.
All right, great. The next question we had is, what is kind of the impact of interference on Wi-Fi networks?
So this really depends. So some users will ask what's the impact of Wi-Fi networks interfering with each other versus other devices that are not Wi-Fi causing interference to Wi-Fi networks. And the answer is actually different for each of those cases. So if you have Wi-Fi networks that are all on the same channel, but they're different SSIDs, they generally play better together than if they're on overlapping channels that aren't, perfectly overlapped. So say I've got 6 networks on channel 1 and 1 network on channel 2. Generally, that 1 network on channel 2 will cause a lot more problems for those 6 networks on channel 1 because when they measure the interference, they cannot tell if it's Wi-Fi or something else. But if they're all overlapped on the same channel, they can hear each other very clearly, and they know they know when each other is transmitting and receiving, and that increases the efficiency of how they use that limited airtime resource. Now, for devices that are not Wi-Fi at all, like microwave ovens or Bluetooth or Zigbee or whatever else you have, those devices generally act different depending upon the signals that they generate. And so for something like Bluetooth or Zigbee, those are pretty minimally impacted on Wi-Fi networks because they hop around the entire 2.4 gigahertz band, which is around 100 megahertz wide. That's a lot of space for them to operate. But for something like a microwave oven, when it's on, it's generally focused in one part of the band, and it's very detrimental while it's running to any Wi-Fi network that may be overlapping with the part of the band that it's sitting on. That could be, I believe, channel 11 in that area is actually quite common for microwave ovens. So it varies.
Okay, yeah, that's a great answer. So the next question we had in is how do Wi-Fi networks change over distance?
So it really depends on how the networks are set up. So for enterprise grade networks, sometimes these access points that are enterprise grade can go quite far and provide service. Maybe especially if you're outdoors, you're talking maybe a couple thousand feet in some extreme cases, which is a pretty decent range. But unlike, one thing that we always have to keep in mind is that Wi-Fi networks are not just a function of the access point, they're also a function of the device. And so just like in cellular networks, we have this problem where our base stations, we can see our signal, we might have 3 or 4 bars on our phone, but if we're actually in an environment where the link from our phone back to the base station is compromised because of some blockage or our phone just doesn't have a high transmit power, that can basically kill the usability of our network, right? And so people think when you map out a Wi-Fi network, if you just get the received signal strength of the access point, that's sufficient enough to give you an answer as to what kind of service you're going to get. But the reality is, when devices are operating on that network, not only is the access point communicating with those devices, the devices are communicating in the opposite direction. So transmissions are happening in both directions, but those devices generally do not have the same antennas or transmit power or receive sensitivity characteristics of the latest and greatest access point. So that's something that needs to be considered as well.
All right, and looks like we have time for just a few more questions. The next one, do you see 802.11ac as kind of the growing standard for home use?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot more use of 802.11ac in the latest and greatest routers. But of course, the limitation of 802.11ac is that it's in 5 gigahertz band, right? So you may see when you go to Best Buy an 802.11ac router that guarantees you like gigabit per second rates, and you think, oh, that's great, that's going to solve any capacity issues I have at home. But there's 2 issues with that. One, if you don't have gigabit service to the home, you're not going to get gigabit service into the internet. So that's one thing that you have to consider, is what's that service to your home. The other is that to get those kinds of rates, you generally have to be sitting right next to the access point. And even then, there's a ton of overhead that goes into transmitting packets in an 802.11 network. that you don't see in wired networks. That's because there's other users, there's contention, there's lots of other things that have to occur. And when you transmit data, it's a half duplex system. The same wireless resource is being used to transmit and receive. And if you transmit it and receive at the same time, at least in today's networks, that can cause collisions, right? Now, that is not necessarily going to be the case for tomorrow's networks, but that's a different topic.
And the next question, can you discuss more about the 60 gigahertz standard coming out?
Yes, so some users have seen the new 802.11 standard that operates in 60 gigahertz as a potential, lifesaver for all problems. But the reality of 60 gigahertz is that the RF propagation characteristics actually behave very similar to light. So if you close a door, that can generally kill your signal. So 60 gigahertz is really good for very short range, very high bandwidth applications. There's a lot of available bandwidth at that frequency, but it's not something that's going to replace your home network and provide coverage to your whole home. That's not going to be something that a single 60 gigahertz access point or system is going to be able to deliver. But you could envision like a house, just like this is very similar to how cellular networks do it. In areas where you might have a high capacity or high density of traffic, there's going to be a lot of usage. You could have little 60 gigahertz like hotspots actually placed in your house that may provide service to like maybe a bedroom or something, but it's going to be a much, much smaller range.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Bill, I think the timing for 60 gig deployments it's certainly years out. I mean, you asked the question earlier, Kyle, around AC. That's the dominant spectrum at 5 gig that's been shipping today. Certainly N is the dominant radio out in the field, but AC is the dominant one shipping. 60 gig, the spec's been released. We're probably years away before I think we start seeing some real solutions that really offer some of that seamless coverage. And I think Bill really covered it well regarding, whole home usage. Might even have more challenges when you start using 60 gig because of that
definitely
propagation,
Definitely, yeah. It's a very short range technology. The thing that's coming around the mountain, so to speak, in the next few years, that's going to be still in 5 gigahertz is 802.11ax, and that's pushing physical layer rates around 10 gigabit per second, but basically using all the available bandwidth in 5 gigahertz. So eventually, 5 gigahertz is going to look very similar to what 2.4 is like today.
Gotcha, thank you. So that's about all the time we have for today. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, Overcoming the Challenges in Delivering Seamless Wi-Fi Throughout the Home, presented by Greenlee Communications. Again, our presenters today were Jason Byrne, Director of Product Management at Greenlee, and then also from Greenlee, we had Bill Kasch helping out on the Q&A. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Carl.